A massive thank you to Vortex9119 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have story ideas you'd like to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these immersive tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between mystery and reality. What if I told you that buried beneath a 1,000-year-old chapel in Ethiopia lies something so powerful that governments have spent decades ensuring you never learn about it? What if every conflict, every war, every uprising in that region wasn't random chaos, but a response to something ancient awakening? My name is Alex Morrison, and 3 months ago, I was just another satellite imaging technician, analysing ground-penetrating radar for a living. Now I'm hiding in a cabin in rural Montana, and I may be the only person alive who knows the truth about what's really buried in Axum. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. That's what you do when you're 3 weeks behind on satellite analysis reports, and your supervisor keeps sending those passive-aggressive emails with red exclamation points. I was a field technician for Orbital Dynamics, a mid-tier satellite imaging company that contracted with everyone from agricultural firms to mining corporations. My job was simple: analyse ground-penetrating radar scans, identify subsurface anomalies and file reports. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous, just data. The Horn of Africa cluster had been sitting on my desk for 2 days. Standard geological survey for a potential infrastructure project in Ethiopia. Roads, power lines, the usual development stuff that required knowing what lay beneath the surface. I'd already processed 47 grids of unremarkable sediment layers and bedrock formations when I opened grid 48. The image loaded pixel by pixel, revealing the familiar topography of northern Ethiopia. Rolling hills, scattered vegetation, and the ancient town of Axum with its towering obelisks and stone churches. But there, beneath the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. A perfect geometric void. Not a cave, not a natural formation. The radar signature showed clean, straight edges forming a rectangular shape, approximately 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. The dimensions were so precise they could have been cut with industrial equipment. Yet the surrounding rock layers indicated this void had existed for centuries, possibly millennia. I pulled up the analysis protocols on my second monitor. Standard procedure for unexplained anomalies was clear. Mark as geological inconsistency or data corruption, and move on. The company didn't pay us to solve mysteries, just to identify potential construction hazards. But those dimensions nagged at me. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. I'd heard those measurements before, in some half-remembered history class or documentary. Something biblical. I saved the image to my personal drive before marking the official report as data corruption. Recommend resurvey. My supervisor would approve it without a second glance, and the client would order new scans of the area that would somehow never quite capture that same perfect void again. As I prepared to move on to the next grid, I noticed something else in the metadata. The thermal overlay showed heat signatures throughout the scan area, solar absorption on the surface, geothermal activity deeper down, all normal patterns, except for the void. The void was 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding rock despite being completely enclosed. Dead objects don't generate heat. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, but no amount of analysis could explain what I was looking at. Finally, I closed the file and went home, but the image followed me. Those perfect dimensions, that impossible heat signature, the way it sat directly beneath one of Christianity's most sacred sites. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. The traditional dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. That night, I dreamed of golden cherubim with wings spread wide, and a voice that spoke from between them with the sound of rushing water. In the dream, I was standing in a stone chamber, lit by a light that cast no shadows, reaching toward a box that hummed with power. The moment my fingers touched the gold, I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild after a long day staring at radar scans. But when I checked my phone, I found I'd been unconsciously searching for information about Axum, about the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, about ancient artifacts hidden beneath holy ground. The next morning I couldn't focus on anything else. I pulled up the scan again, studying every pixel, every thermal gradient, every impossible detail of that buried void. This wasn't data corruption. This was something real, something significant, something that had been deliberately hidden from the world. Something that was waiting. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Ethiopia. I'd convinced my supervisor that the Axum anomaly required ground truthing, a field verification to ensure our radar systems were functioning correctly. The company approved the trip because it sounded technical and responsible, not because I'd spent every spare moment researching the legend of the Ark's journey from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. According to tradition, the Queen of Sheba took the Ark back to Ethiopia after her visit to King Solomon. Her son, Menelik I, founded the Ethiopian Empire and established Axum as its capital. For 3,000 years, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians had claimed the true Ark of the Covenant rested in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by a single monk who could never leave the sacred precinct. Tourist nonsense, I'd always assumed. Every culture claimed to have some piece of biblical history hidden in their backyard. But now I had radar evidence of something buried exactly where the legend said it would be. Something that matched the Ark's traditional dimensions and somehow generated heat despite being entombed in solid rock. I landed in Addis Ababa on a Tuesday morning and caught a domestic flight to Axum the same day. The town was smaller than I'd expected. A collection of low buildings scattered around the famous obelisk park and the twin churches that claim to house the world's greatest religious relic. Tourists wandered between the ancient stone monuments, taking selfies with 3,000-year-old carved pillars, while guides recited well-practiced speeches about Queen Sheba and King Solomon. I hired a local guide named Dawit, a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and careful English who specialised in the historical sites. We spent the first day touring the obelisk park and the ruins of ancient palaces, but I was really just getting a feel for the area, trying to match the topography to my radar scans. Tomorrow we visit the churches, Dawit said as we walked back to my hotel. The old church and the new church. Very sacred places. Can tourists go inside both churches? I asked, trying to sound casual. The new church, yes. Beautiful paintings, ancient books, many treasures. But the old church... He paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. The old church is different. Only priests allowed inside and the guardian. The guardian? One monk, chosen for life. He watches over the... Dawit lowered his voice. Over what is kept there. He can never leave the church grounds. Never. He stays until he dies. Then another is chosen. We'd reached my hotel, but I wasn't ready to end the conversation. What exactly is he guarding? Dawit looked uncomfortable. Christians say it is the Tablet, the Ark of Moses. Others say it is just tradition, just stories. But I have lived in Axum all my life, and I tell you this, the Guardian is real. I have seen him walking in the church courtyard at night, always alone, always watching. What does he look like? Old, but not in years. Old in ... Dawit struggled for the word. Old in soul. Like a man who has seen too much, carries too much weight. His eyes. He shuddered. I do not like to look at his eyes. That night I lay in bed studying satellite photos of the church complex on my laptop. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion was actually 2 buildings. A newer church built in the 1960s where tourists and worshippers could visit, and a smaller, older chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. The older building sat directly above the void I detected in the radar scan. According to everything I'd read, no outsider had been permitted inside the chapel in centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained absolute secrecy about what was housed there, allowing only the guardian and select high-ranking clergy to enter. Even the country's government respected the restriction, treating the chapel as sovereign territory beyond their jurisdiction. But tomorrow, I'd at least be able to see the building from the outside, maybe get close enough to take some thermal readings with the handheld scanner I'd brought. It wasn't much, but it might help me understand what was generating that heat signature 12 feet below ground. The next morning, Dawit led me through Axum's narrow streets toward the church complex. We passed market stalls selling coffee and spices, elderly women spinning cotton on wooden wheels, children playing soccer with a ball made of rags. Normal life in a normal town that happened to claim possession of humanity's most powerful religious artifact. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound was surrounded by a high stone wall with an ornate gate. Beyond the entrance I could see the modern church with its painted dome and arched windows, and behind that, partially hidden by trees, the smaller chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. "We can tour the new church," DeWitt explained as we approached the gate. "Beautiful interior, many ancient paintings and manuscripts, but the chapel behind it," he pointed to the smaller building, "that is forbidden." We passed through the gate into a courtyard filled with pilgrims and tourists. The modern church was indeed impressive, with colourful frescoes covering every wall and elaborate religious artefacts displayed in glass cases. But I found myself constantly glancing toward the windows that faced the restricted chapel, trying to catch a glimpse of the building that sat above my mysterious void. After an hour of dutifully admiring religious art, I excused myself to use the restroom, then slipped outside into the courtyard. The restricted chapel was maybe 50 yards away, separated from the public area by a low fence and some carefully placed shrubs. I walked casually in that direction, pulling out my phone as if taking pictures of the church architecture. The chapel was older than the main building, constructed from rough stone blocks that had been weathered smooth by centuries of highland rain. Small, narrow windows pierced the walls at regular intervals, but they were too high and too dark to see inside. The building's footprint was roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, large enough to house a small congregation, or to contain something that required a significant amount of protective space. As I was trying to estimate the building's exact position relative to my radar scan, a figure appeared in one of the windows. The Guardian. Even from 50 yards away I could see that Dawit hadn't exaggerated. The man's face was gaunt to the point of being skeletal, his skin pale as parchment despite Ethiopia's intense sun. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch, dark, hollow, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age. Eyes that had seen something no human should see, carried some weight that was slowly crushing the life out of him. For a long moment we stared at each other across the courtyard. Then the Guardian raised one thin hand and made a clear gesture. "Go away." Not a casual dismissal, but an urgent warning, the kind of motion you'd make to stop someone from stepping into traffic. As I watched, his lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You don't want what's inside." Then he disappeared from the window, leaving me standing in the courtyard with my heart hammering and my thermal scanner forgotten in my pocket. The Guardian hadn't just been warning me away from the chapel. He'd been warning me away from whatever was buried beneath it, whatever was generating that impossible heat signature 12 feet underground. Whatever had been slowly killing him with its proximity for however many years, he'd been trapped in that building. I found Dawit waiting by the main church entrance, looking concerned. "You saw him," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. Then you understand why I do not like to look at his eyes. Come, we should go. There are other sights to see, happier places." But as we left the church compound, I couldn't stop thinking about that desperate gesture, that silent warning. The Guardian knew something was down there, something that had been affecting him for years, possibly decades, something that pulsed with heat and waited in the darkness beneath ancient stone. That night I called my supervisor and extended my stay in Ethiopia by a week. Back in my hotel room, I spread out printed satellite photos across the bed and fired up my laptop. The thermal scanner I'd brought was designed for surface readings, useless for penetrating 12 feet of stone and earth, but I had access to something better. Orbital Dynamics' complete archive of satellite data for the region. If the object beneath the chapel was generating heat, that heat had to go somewhere. And if I was right about what was down there, the heat generation might not be constant. I started with our company's historical scans of Axum, going back 15 years to when we first began regular coverage of the Horn of Africa. The early images showed the same thermal patterns I'd seen in the recent scan: solar absorption, geothermal activity, normal ground temperatures, but the void beneath the chapel was already 3 degrees warmer than its surroundings, even in the oldest images. 15 years of continuous heat generation. Whatever was down there wasn't running on batteries. I pulled up the metadata for each scan, looking for variations in the thermal signature over time. For the first few years, the readings were remarkably consistent. 3 degrees above ambient, no significant fluctuation. Then, starting in 2010, the pattern began to change. Small spikes at first, maybe half a degree increases that lasted for a few days before returning to baseline. But as I worked forward through the data, the spikes became more frequent and more intense. By 2018, I was seeing heat surges of 6 to 8 degrees above normal, sometimes lasting for weeks. The most recent scan, the one that had started this whole investigation, showed the highest readings yet. Nearly 12 degrees above the surrounding rock temperature, sustained over the 3-day period when the satellite had passed over the region. I sat back, staring at the data visualization on my screen. The heat signature wasn't just evidence that something was buried beneath the chapel. It was evidence that something was becoming more active, more powerful, more awake. But what could cause those kinds of fluctuations? I needed to correlate the thermal spikes with external events, see if there was a pattern I was missing. I opened a new browser window and started searching for news archives covering Ethiopia and the surrounding region. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, anything that might correspond to the dates when the thermal readings spiked. The first major heat spike had occurred in September 2010. I cross-referenced the date and found coverage of renewed fighting in South Sudan, just a few hundred miles from Axum. Border clashes, civilian casualties, the usual litany of African conflict. The heat signature had jumped to 6 degrees above normal and stayed there for 2 weeks. December 2014, another spike, this one lasting almost a month. I found reports of protests in Ethiopia's Oromia region that had turned violent, with government forces killing dozens of demonstrators. The thermal readings had peaked at 8 degrees above normal. March 2019, the biggest spike yet, nearly 10 degrees above ambient temperature. Major fighting had erupted between Ethiopia and Eritrea along their shared border, the worst violence in years between the two countries. Thousands of troops mobilized, artillery exchanges, threats of full-scale war. The pattern was undeniable. Every time conflict erupted in the region, the object beneath the chapel became more active. Not just reactive, but almost anticipatory. Some of the thermal spikes had begun days or even weeks before the first news reports of violence. I leaned back in the hotel room's uncomfortable chair, trying to process what the data was telling me. If the Ark of the Covenant was really buried beneath that chapel, and if it was somehow responding to regional conflicts, what did that mean? According to biblical accounts, the Ark had been a weapon, used by the Israelites to destroy their enemies and part the Jordan River. But those were just stories, weren't they? Ancient myths to explain natural phenomena or military victories. Except now I had 15 years of satellite data suggesting those stories might have been more literal than anyone imagined. I opened a new search window and typed in Ark of the Covenant Biblical Powers. The results were a mixture of scholarly articles, religious websites, and conspiracy theories, but certain themes appeared consistently. The Ark as a communication device between God and Moses. The Ark as a weapon capable of destroying armies. The Ark as a source of divine power that killed anyone who touched it improperly. One academic paper caught my attention. Electromagnetic Anomalies in Biblical Texts, a technical analysis of the Ark narrative. The author, a physicist from MIT, had attempted to explain the Ark's described effects in terms of advanced technology rather than divine intervention. According to his analysis, the biblical descriptions were consistent with some kind of high-energy, electromagnetic device, possibly using principles that modern science was only beginning to understand. The paper was 8 years old and had been largely ignored by mainstream academia, but its conclusions were fascinating. If the Ark contained technology rather than divine presence, technology based on electromagnetic manipulation of space-time, then its effects on local conflicts might be measurable, predictable, even controllable. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but I wasn't tired. I had 15 years of data to analyse, patterns to uncover, connections to make. If I was right about what was happening, the implications went far beyond archaeological discovery. This was about a weapon that had been influencing regional conflicts for decades, maybe centuries, sitting 12 feet beneath a chapel in northern Ethiopia, a weapon that was becoming more active. I pulled up the most recent thermal readings again, studying the heat signature that had triggered this entire investigation. 12 degrees above ambient temperature, the highest reading yet. And according to the news feeds I'd been monitoring, tensions were rising again along the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. Troop movements, diplomatic protests, the same warning signs that had preceded every previous spike in the thermal data. If the pattern held, the heat signature beneath the chapel would spike again within days, and somewhere in the Horn of Africa, people would start dying. I saved all my analysis to an encrypted drive and uploaded backup copies to 3 different cloud storage services. Whatever was happening in Axum, I was probably the only person outside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood the connection between the buried object and regional violence. The only person who could prove that the Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a religious relic, but an active weapon that had been shaping the history of East Africa for 3 millennia. The only person who might be able to stop it. I had a contact at the Vatican archives, someone I'd met at a conference on satellite archaeology 3 years earlier. Elena Rossi was a researcher specialising in the historical verification of biblical sites, and she had access to documents that most scholars could only dream of seeing. If anyone could tell me what the Catholic Church knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, it would be her. I drafted a carefully worded email describing my satellite findings in technical terms, without mentioning my theories about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. I presented it as an archaeological question. Had the Vatican ever investigated the Ethiopian Orthodox claims about possessing the Ark of the Covenant? Elena's response came within 6 hours, which surprised me. Her replies usually took days, given the bureaucratic nature of Vatican communications. Alex, your inquiry has been noted and forwarded to the appropriate department. However, I must inform you that materials related to your specific request are currently under protocol relic restrictions. I cannot provide further information at this time. I would advise against pursuing this research direction. E. Rossi, Protocol Relic. I'd never heard the term before, and a quick internet search turned up nothing. No academic papers, no government documents, no casual references in religious forums. It was as if the phrase existed in a completely separate information ecosystem, one that normal researchers couldn't access. That afternoon, my hotel room phone rang. The caller ID showed only international with no number. Mr. Morrison. The voice was American, middle-aged, with the kind of neutral accent that comes from years of diplomatic training. Yes, my name is Cardinal Michael Toretti, Vatican Secretariat of State. I understand you've been making inquiries about certain historical artifacts currently held by our Ethiopian Orthodox colleagues. A cardinal calling me directly. In 31 years of life, I'd never been important enough to warrant attention from anyone higher than a district manager, and now I had a Vatican cardinal on the line. I'm a satellite imaging technician, I said carefully. I analyse ground-penetrating radar for geological surveys. Yes, we're aware of your professional background. We're also aware of your recent travel to Axum and your communication with Dr. Rossi. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling to advise you that you've stumbled into an area of inquiry that falls under Vatican security protocols. For your own safety, I strongly recommend that you discontinue this research and return to the United States immediately. My own safety? There are historical artifacts that were never meant to be disturbed, Mr. Morrison. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained certain guardianship responsibilities for nearly 3 millennia. That arrangement exists for the protection of all concerned parties. I could feel my heart racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. What is Protocol Relic? There was a long pause. You're not cleared for that information, nor do you want to be. Take my advice, Mr. Morrison. Book the next flight home and forget whatever you think you've discovered in Axum. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The line went dead. I sat in my hotel room for a long time after that call, staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. A cardinal in the Vatican Secretariat of State, essentially the Catholic Church's Secretary of State, had called me personally to warn me away from my research. Not a local church official, not even a regional administrator, but someone at the very highest levels of Vatican hierarchy. Which meant the Catholic Church not only knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, they were actively monitoring anyone who showed too much interest in investigating those claims. They had files on researchers, protocols for managing inquiries, and enough influence to track down a satellite technician in an Ethiopian hotel within hours of his asking the wrong questions. I thought about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his desperate warning, "You don't want what's inside." Maybe he wasn't just protecting the Ark from the world. Maybe he was protecting the world from the Ark. My laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was listed as E. Rossi, but the message was clearly not from Elena. "Mr. Morrison, this will be my final communication on this matter. Protocol Relic is a Vatican security classification established in 1962 following certain discoveries made during the Second Vatican Council's review of sealed archives. Materials under this classification are restricted to a maximum of 12 individuals worldwide, all of whom hold positions equivalent to cardinal or higher within the Catholic hierarchy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained custody of the artifact in question under a formal agreement dating to 1965. This agreement recognises Ethiopian sovereignty over the artifact in exchange for adherence to specific containment protocols established by a joint Vatican-Ethiopian commission. These protocols exist because the artifact exhibits properties that pose significant risks to regional stability when improperly handled or exposed. The Guardian tradition is not merely ceremonial, it serves a crucial containment function that has prevented numerous potential catastrophes over the past several decades. Your thermal analysis data has been reviewed by our technical staff. We are aware of the correlations you have identified. We are also aware of the artifact's increasing activity levels over the past 5 years. A joint Vatican-Ethiopian assessment team is currently evaluating options for enhanced containment measures. This communication will self-delete in 60 seconds. Do not attempt to copy or save this message. Return to the United States immediately and discontinue all research related to this matter. You have been warned twice. There will not be a third warning. I watched the message count down from 60 seconds, trying to memorize every word. When it reached 0, the email disappeared from my inbox as if it had never existed. But I'd learned what I needed to know. The Vatican knew about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. They'd known for years, possibly decades. And they were worried enough about increasing activity levels to consider enhanced containment measures. The Ark of the Covenant was real, it was buried beneath the chapel in Axum, and it was becoming more dangerous. I needed to get that thermal data to someone who could do something about it. Someone outside the Vatican's sphere of influence. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I opened my laptop and began typing up a detailed summary of everything I'd discovered. The satellite data, the thermal correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican security protocols, the Guardian's warning. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record of what I'd found. Outside my hotel window, the ancient obelisks of Axum stood silhouetted against the Ethiopian night sky. Monuments to a civilization that had claimed to possess God's greatest gift to humanity. 12 feet below, a simple stone chapel. Something waited in the darkness, growing stronger, growing more active, preparing for something that would make the regional conflicts of the past 15 years look like minor skirmishes. And I was probably the only person outside the Vatican and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood what was coming. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of booking a flight home like the Vatican had demanded, I drove the rental car to a cybercafe in Addis Ababa and uploaded a carefully edited version of my satellite data to Reddit. I chose the r/conspiracy subreddit because I knew it would get attention without being taken seriously by any official monitoring systems. The post was titled, Weird thermal anomaly under Ethiopian church. Anyone know what this could be? I included 3 of the clearer thermal images showing the heat signature beneath the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, along with GPS coordinates and a brief description of the geometric void. I deliberately left out any mention of the Ark, the Vatican communications, or the correlations with regional conflicts. To casual readers, it would look like a curious geological anomaly discovered by a satellite technician who was genuinely puzzled by what he'd found. The post got 17 comments in the first hour. Most were jokes about ancient aliens or government cover-ups, but a few showed genuine technical interest. One user with apparent geology credentials suggested underground geothermal activity. Another pointed out that the heat signature was too localized and too geometric to be natural. I was reading through the comments when my laptop screen went black. Not a normal shutdown or crash, but an instantaneous cut-off as if someone had yanked the power cord. Except the laptop was running on battery power and the charging light was still on. The screen stayed black for maybe 10 seconds, then flickered back to life showing the Windows startup sequence. When the system finished rebooting, my Reddit post was gone. Not deleted with a moderator message, not removed for violating community guidelines, but completely absent as if it had never existed. My browser history showed no record of visiting Reddit. The thermal images I'd uploaded weren't in my recent files folder. Someone had remotely accessed my laptop and scrubbed all evidence of the post, while leaving everything else untouched. I sat in the internet cafe for a long time, watching Ethiopian families use the other computers to video chat with relatives abroad and university students researching papers. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the fact that I'd just learned something terrifying about the reach and capabilities of whoever was monitoring research into the Axum artifact. They had hacked my laptop remotely, selectively deleted specific files, and removed all trace of my Reddit post within hours of its publication. This wasn't just Vatican influence or church pressure. This was signals intelligence, cyber warfare capabilities, the kind of resources that only major governments or international intelligence agencies could deploy. I paid for my computer time and walked back to the rental car, feeling like I was being watched even though the street looked perfectly normal. Addis Ababa traffic flowed around me with its usual chaotic energy. Buses packed with passengers, merchants pushing handcarts loaded with goods, children selling bottled water at red lights. But someone in that crowd could be monitoring me. Someone with access to satellite feeds and facial recognition software, and the authority to scrub information from major social media platforms in real time. That night, back in my hotel room in Axum, I made backup copies of all my remaining data and hid them in 3 different locations around the town. One encrypted drive taped under a restaurant table where I'd eaten dinner, another hidden in the base of an ancient obelisk in the archaeological park, the third buried in a plastic bag near a tree outside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, as close to the chapel as I could get without being seen. If they could hack my devices remotely, I needed analog backups they couldn't access digitally. The next morning I woke to find my hotel room door unlocked. I always use the deadbolt and chain lock, habits from years of business travel. But both were disengaged, and there was no sign of forced entry. My luggage had been searched with professional thoroughness. Everything returned to almost exactly its original position, but with tiny variations that proved someone had been through my belongings. My laptop was still there, apparently untouched. My cameras and field equipment were undisturbed, but the encrypted drive where I'd stored copies of the satellite data was missing from the hidden compartment in my suitcase. They'd taken only what they needed and left everything else to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. Except they'd made one mistake. They'd unlocked the door when they left, probably to avoid the sound of manipulating the locks from inside. I was no longer just being monitored, I was being actively managed. I packed quickly and checked out of the hotel, telling the desk clerk I had a family emergency back in the United States. But instead of heading to the airport, I drove to the archaeological park and retrieved the data drive I'd hidden at the base of the obelisk. Sitting in the rental car with ancient stone monuments all around me, I made one final attempt to get the information out. I logged into an anonymous email account I'd created years earlier and composed a message to every major news organisation I could think of: CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, the New York Times. The subject line was simple: evidence of active electromagnetic anomaly at claimed Ark of Covenant site in Ethiopia. In the body of the message I laid out everything: the satellite thermal data, the correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican's protocol relic warnings, the cyber intrusion and hotel room search. I attached the clearest thermal images and GPS coordinates, along with a detailed timeline showing how the heat signature had intensified over 15 years. I hit send and watched the message appear in my outbox, then immediately start moving to the sent folder. Except it never arrived. I tried again with a different email service, then a third. Same result every time. The messages showed as sent from my end, but never reached their destinations. Someone was intercepting my communications at the internet service provider level, identifying and blocking any transmission that contained my satellite data or references to the Axum thermal anomaly. I was completely isolated, cut off from any normal channels of communication, surrounded by an electronic net that prevented me from sharing what I'd discovered. But I still had the physical drive hidden near the church, and I still had one option they couldn't control remotely. That afternoon, I walked to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound, and found a spot where I could observe the restricted chapel from a distance. Tourists and pilgrims moved through the public areas, taking photos and buying souvenirs, while the Guardian's building sat silent and forbidden behind its fence. I waited until late afternoon, when the crowds thinned and the light was beginning to fade. Then I walked casually toward the area where I'd buried the encrypted drive, as if I were just another tourist admiring the ancient architecture. The drive was gone. The plastic bag was still there, exactly where I'd buried it, but empty. They'd found my backup, extracted the data, and left the bag as a message. We know where you've been. We know what you've hidden. We can reach anything you think is secure. As I stood there staring at the empty bag, a shadow fell across the ground beside me. I looked up to see the Guardian standing at one of the chapel windows, his hollow eyes fixed on my face. But this time, he wasn't warning me away. He was nodding, almost imperceptibly, as if he approved of what I'd been trying to do. Then he pointed downward, toward the ground beneath my feet, and mouthed a single word I could read clearly even at 50 yards distance. Soon! I flew back to the United States the next day, but I never made it to my apartment in Denver. 2 men in dark suits were waiting for me at baggage claim, holding a sign with my name and looking like the kind of federal agents you see in movies. "Mr. Morrison, we're with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about your recent travel activities." They escorted me to a windowless room in the airport's security section, where a third man was waiting with a thick folder and a digital recorder. "I'm Agent Phillips," the older man said. "We understand you've been conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering in Ethiopia, specifically related to sites of religious significance to our Ethiopian government partners. I'm a satellite imaging technician. I analyze geological data for mining and construction companies. We're aware of your professional background, Mr. Morrison. We're also aware that you've been making inquiries about classified materials with Vatican contacts, posting sensitive imagery to social media platforms, and attempting to contact media organizations with what you claim is evidence of electromagnetic anomalies at Ethiopian Orthodox Church sites. They knew everything. Not just my activities in Ethiopia, but my attempts to share the data, my communications with Elena Rossi, even my failed Reddit post. The thermal imagery you captured falls under the jurisdiction of several international agreements regarding the protection of cultural and religious sites," Phillips continued. "Specifically, it relates to a joint Vatican-Ethiopian cultural preservation protocol that supersedes normal academic or journalistic access. Cultural preservation protocol? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has requested that certain sites be protected from unauthorized analysis or exposure that might damage their religious significance or cultural integrity. The Vatican has agreed to help enforce these protections as part of ongoing interfaith cooperation initiatives. It was a lie, of course. They weren't protecting cultural sites. They were suppressing evidence of something that posed a much more serious threat. but I was sitting in a windowless room at the Denver airport with 3 federal agents, and my laptop had already demonstrated that normal channels of communication were compromised. "We're prepared to offer you a choice, Mr. Morrison," Philip said. "You can sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your recent research activities, accept reassignment to a different geographical focus area within your company, and continue your career with no further complications. Or we can discuss this matter with your employer, your security clearance sponsors, and potentially with federal prosecutors who take a very dim view of unauthorized intelligence activities in sensitive foreign locations." I stared at the folder on the table between us, thinking about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his final gesture toward the ground beneath the chapel. Thinking about 15 years of thermal data showing an ancient weapon growing stronger, more active, more dangerous. What happens if I sign? You return to your normal work assignments. You avoid any further research related to Ethiopian archaeological sites. You don't discuss your recent findings with colleagues, media contacts, or internet forums. In exchange, we ensure that your employer receives a positive assessment of your professionalism and discretion during this culturally sensitive assignment. And if I don't sign? Phillips opened the folder and showed me the first page. It was a letter from Orbital Dynamics' Human Resources Department, dated that morning, informing me that my employment had been terminated due to misuse of company resources for unauthorized personal research projects. "Your security clearance will be revoked," he continued. "Your access to government contracting databases will be permanently blocked, and we'll be sharing our assessment of your activities with other satellite imaging companies, geological survey firms, and any future employers who request background information." They were offering to destroy my career or let me pretend none of this had ever happened, but either way, the information I'd gathered would never reach anyone who could act on it. I thought about Cardinal Toretti's warning on the phone. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. Maybe this was the price. Professional destruction, isolation, the slow erasure of everything I'd worked to build over the past decade. I need time to think about it. "You have until we finish processing your luggage, 20 minutes, maybe 30. 20 minutes to decide whether to sacrifice my career for information that no one would believe, no one could verify, and no one was allowed to investigate." I signed the non-disclosure agreement. They released me 2 hours later with a stern warning about the consequences of violating federal agreements, and a business card with a phone number I could call if I ever felt tempted to discuss my Ethiopian research with anyone. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the only person who had access to the satellite data. That night in my apartment in Denver, I opened my laptop and logged into Orbital Dynamics employee portal. My access had been suspended, as expected, but the system showed I was still listed as being on authorized leave for another 3 days. Someone had delayed updating my termination in the central database. I used those 3 days to access everything I could reach. Not just my own analysis files, but the complete archive of satellite coverage for the Horn of Africa going back to the company's founding. If the thermal anomaly beneath the Axum Chapel was increasing in intensity, there might be other sites showing similar patterns, other locations where ancient artifacts were responding to modern conflicts. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The Ark wasn't unique, it was part of a network. Thermal anomalies appeared at 17 different locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all buried beneath religious sites, all generating heat signatures that correlated with regional violence. A geometric void beneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Another under the Great Mosque of Mecca. Heat sources beneath Christian monasteries in Syria, Coptic churches in Egypt, ancient temples in Iraq. Every major conflict of the past 2 decades, the Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War, the Arab Spring, the ongoing violence in Yemen and Libya, correlated with intensified thermal activity at multiple sites, as if the artifacts were communicating with each other, coordinating their responses to human warfare. I copied everything I could access onto encrypted drives and mailed them to safety deposit boxes in 3 different states. Then I submitted my resignation from Orbital Dynamics, citing personal reasons, and disappeared. For 3 weeks I lived in cheap motels and paid for everything with cash, moving from city to city while I tried to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. The thermal network wasn't just evidence of ancient technology, it was evidence of an active weapons system that had been influencing human conflict for millennia. A weapons system that was becoming more coordinated, more responsive, more powerful. On a Tuesday morning in Salt Lake City, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena Rossi. "Alex, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Elena, I thought you were under Vatican restrictions." "I'm calling from a secure line. Listen carefully. Something has happened. The Ethiopian government has sealed off the entire Axum region. No flights in or out, no ground access, complete media blackout. They're claiming it's a military exercise, but my sources inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church say it's something else." "What kind of something else?" "The Guardian is dead, Alex. He died 3 days ago. And when they went to choose his replacement, they found the chapel empty. Whatever was buried beneath the church, it's gone." I felt the blood drain from my face. Gone how? No one knows. The Ethiopian military is conducting a grid search of the entire region, but there's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of excavation, no indication that anyone broke into the chapel. The artifact simply left. That's impossible. Satellite thermal imaging shows massive energy spikes at 17 locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all occurring within a 6-hour window starting with the Guardian's death. The Vatican has activated something called the Omega Protocol, and they're requesting immediate assistance from the United States, Russia and China. The Omega Protocol. I'd never heard the term before, but I could guess what it meant. The final contingency, the last resort when all other containment measures had failed. "Eleanor, where are you calling from?" "I'm at a monastery in Switzerland. The Vatican has evacuated all protocol relic personnel to secure locations. They're expecting the worst." "What's the worst?" "According to the sealed archives, the last time the artifacts were fully active was during the Crusades. The entire geopolitical structure of 3 continents collapsed within a century. Empires fell, entire populations migrated, technological development stalled for 500 years. I thought about the thermal data I'd collected, the correlations between artifact activity and regional violence. If the Ark and its companion devices were no longer contained, no longer isolated in buried chambers beneath ancient churches, what would happen to the world?" "Alex, are you still there?" "Yeah." "Eleanor, I need you to do something. I'm going to send you coordinates for safety deposit boxes in Phoenix, Dallas and Atlanta. Inside each box is a complete archive of satellite data showing the thermal network. If something happens to me, make sure that information reaches someone who can act on it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find the Ark. The line went dead." That afternoon I bought a plane ticket to Ethiopia under a false name, using identity documents I'd acquired during my weeks of hiding. If the Ethiopian government had sealed off the Axum region, I'd have to find another way in, but I was probably the only person outside government and religious authorities who understood the scope of what was happening. The only person who might be able to track down a 3,000-year-old weapon that had just escaped from its prison and was preparing to reshape human civilization. I'm writing this from a cabin in the mountains of western Montana, 6 months after the Axum incident. The official story is that a localized seismic event damaged several ancient structures in northern Ethiopia, requiring temporary military restrictions while archaeological assessment teams evaluate the cultural heritage impact. The real story is that 17 ancient weapons have vanished from their containment sites across 3 continents, leaving behind nothing but empty chambers and the withered corpses of their guardians. The thermal network I discovered through satellite analysis was just the visible symptom of something much older and more complex. For 3 millennia, objects of immense power had been sleeping beneath humanity's most sacred sites, occasionally stirring in response to nearby conflicts, but generally remaining dormant under the watch of religious orders that had forgotten why they were really guarding empty rooms. Now they're awake, active and loose in a world with 7 billion people, and enough weapons to destroy civilization a dozen times over. Elena kept her promise and distributed copies of my satellite archive to researchers at major universities, intelligence agencies and international organizations. Most dismissed the data as elaborate hoax or misinterpreted sensor readings. A few took it seriously enough to begin their own investigations, only to discover that every relevant database had been scrubbed, every supporting document had vanished, every potential witness had signed binding non-disclosure agreements. But I know the truth is spreading, filtering through the kind of networks that governments can't completely control. Academic conferences where researchers share suspicions in private conversations. Intelligence analysts who notice patterns their superiors don't want them to report. Military officers who track unexplained energy signatures and find their requests for investigation quietly denied. The world is changing, and most people don't realise it yet. Regional conflicts that should burn out quickly are intensifying instead. Ancient ethnic tensions are flaring into violence across Africa and the Middle East. Political movements that seemed stable are fracturing along religious lines. The artifacts aren't causing the conflicts. Humans are perfectly capable of finding reasons to fight each other, but they're amplifying existing tensions, feeding on the emotional energy of warfare and using that power to grow stronger, more coordinated, more influential. I've been tracking their movements through news reports, social media posts, and amateur satellite imagery, shared on forums that haven't been scrubbed yet. Heat signatures appearing in conflict zones days before major battles. Unexplained electromagnetic anomalies detected near military bases. Reports of ancient artifacts being discovered by various armed groups, then quickly disappearing again. They're not random. They're following a pattern, positioning themselves to influence key events, preparing for something bigger than individual regional conflicts. Last week I received an encrypted message through a routing system so complex I couldn't trace its origin. The text was simple. The covenant was not meant for one people or one place. It was meant for all people, all places when the time was ready. The time is now ready. Choose wisely. Choose wisely, as if I have a choice in whatever's coming. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real power of these artifacts isn't their ability to influence events, but their ability to force people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise have to make. The Guardian at Axum spent decades watching over something that was slowly killing him, but he chose to stay, chose to maintain the containment protocols, chose to warn me away from dangers I didn't understand. Now it's my turn to choose. I could destroy this account, burn the remaining evidence, disappear completely into a life where none of this ever happened. Or I can keep tracking the artifacts, documenting their movements, building a record of what's really happening as the world stumbles towards some kind of transformation it doesn't see coming. The cabin where I'm staying sits on 40 acres of isolated mountain forest, far from cities and conflict zones, and the electromagnetic networks that seem to attract the artifact's attention. But even here, on clear nights, I can see strange lights moving across the sky. Not aircraft, not satellites, but something else entirely, following patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. They're out there, 17 pieces of ancient technology that were designed to reshape civilizations, and they're working together now, coordinating their efforts, preparing for something that will make the fall of empires look like minor historical footnotes. I have 3 more encrypted drives hidden in various locations around the country, each containing copies of everything I've learned about the thermal network and the artifact sites. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me, and Elena Rossi or one of the other researchers I contacted managed to get this information published despite whatever security measures are in place to prevent it. Don't dismiss this as conspiracy theory or elaborate fiction. Check the satellite data yourself if you have access. Look for thermal anomalies beneath major religious sites. Track the correlations between unexplained energy signatures and regional conflicts. Pay attention to news reports of ancient artifacts being discovered and then quickly classified or removed by authorities. The pattern is there if you know how to look for it. The Ark of the Covenant was never lost. It was never just sitting passively in some forgotten chamber, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists or treasure hunters. It was sleeping, along with its companion devices, under the protection of guardians who understood that some powers are too dangerous for humanity to wield. Now it's awake, and it's not alone, and it's preparing to fulfill whatever purpose it was originally designed for 3,000 years ago. The only question is whether we'll be ready for what comes next. And I hope this account reaches people who can do something with the information, people with resources and influence, and the courage to investigate what most would rather ignore. But even if it doesn't, even if this becomes just another conspiracy theory lost in the noise of the internet, at least there will be a record of what one satellite technician discovered when he looked too closely at the wrong thermal signature. The Ark Protocol is active, the Covenant has been renewed, and somewhere in the darkness between the ancient and the modern, 17 pieces of divine technology are preparing to reshape the world according to plans that were set in motion before human civilization began. Choose wisely. Alex Morrison, December 2024. Tonight we're diving into a story that will make you question everything you think you know about American history. But first, I want to thank Thundy308 for suggesting this story in the comments. Your ideas keep sleep theories alive. If you have video ideas of your own, drop them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these late night mysteries, please hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between history and conspiracy. Most people don't know America was attacked long before 9/11. Hell, most people don't even know about Pearl Harbor beyond the Hollywood version. But I found out the hard way that our nation's first taste of domestic terrorism happened in 1916, right in New York Harbor. And the real story, it's so much worse than what they taught us in school. My name is irrelevant. Let's just say I'm someone who stumbles into things I shouldn't. 3 months ago, I was helping my grandmother clean out my grandfather's attic in Jersey City. Standard stuff. Old furniture, mouldy books, boxes of Christmas decorations from the 1970s. But tucked away in a corner, beneath a tarp that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades, I found a trunk. Not just any trunk. This thing was old. Really old. The kind of leather and brass construction they don't make anymore, with travel stickers from steamship lines that went out of business before my grandfather was born. The lock was broken, hanging loose like someone had forced it open years ago and never bothered to fix it. Inside, the air smelled of ash and time, burned papers, some so brittle they crumbled when I touched them, insurance ledgers with faded ink. And at the bottom, wrapped in what used to be white cloth, a letter dated July 31st, 1916, the day after the Black Tom explosion. The letter was signed by a man named Samuel Weiser, and he claimed to have witnessed something that, if true, would rewrite American history. He wrote about sabotage, but not the kind they told us about in history class. He wrote about American officials not just watching it happen, but helping it along. They wanted it to happen, the letter said in shaky handwriting. The blast was too perfect, too convenient, and I saw them, our own people, making sure those German boys got exactly where they needed to be. That was 3 months ago. I should have put the letter back, closed the trunk, and pretended I never found it. But curiosity killed more than just cats, and now I'm sitting here at 3 a.m, looking over my shoulder every few minutes, wondering if the same people who silenced Samuel Weiser in 1916 are coming for me next. This is my story. If something happens to me before I can tell it properly, at least it'll be out there. Someone needs to know the truth about Black Tom Island. Let me paint you a picture of what America looked like in 1916. World War I was raging across Europe, turning an entire continent into a muddy graveyard. Officially, the United States was neutral. Unofficially, we were making a fortune selling ammunition to Britain and France through a complex network of shell companies and dummy corporations. The centre of this operation was a place called Black Tom Island. Though calling it an island was generous. It was more like a man-made peninsula jutting into New York Harbor, connected to Jersey City by a narrow causeway. From Manhattan you could see it clearly. Massive warehouses, railroad cars lined up like dominoes, and mountains of ammunition crates waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for European battlefields. On the night of July 30th, 1916, Black Tom Island held over 2 million pounds of ammunition. Dynamite, TNT, artillery shells, rifle cartridges, enough firepower to level half of Manhattan if it all went up at once. At 2:08 a.m. on July 30th it did exactly that. The first explosion shattered windows across lower Manhattan. The second, 30 minutes later, was so powerful it registered as a 5.5 earthquake on seismographs as far away as Philadelphia. Shrapnel embedded itself in the Statue of Liberty's torch arm. Clock towers in Jersey City stopped working. their mechanisms thrown out of alignment. People in Brooklyn thought it was the end of the world. The official story came together remarkably quickly. German saboteurs had infiltrated Black Tom Island and blown up the ammunition depot to prevent American weapons from reaching the Allies. Clean, simple, and perfectly designed to make Americans angry at Germany. But Samuel Weiser's letter told a different story. "I was working the night shift," he wrote, "checking manifests in the office overlooking the main causeway. Around midnight I saw them coming, 3 men in dark coats walking like they owned the place. But they weren't alone. 2 police officers were escorting them, not like prisoners, like guests." According to Weiser, he watched these 5 men walk directly to Warehouse 18, the largest ammunition storage facility on the island. The police officers had keys. They opened doors that should have been locked, disabled alarm systems that should have been active. The Germans, and they were Germans, I could tell by their accents when they talked to each other, they knew exactly where to go, like they had blueprints. The police officers didn't just let them work, they helped them carry the equipment. Weiser wrote that he watched for over an hour as this group systematically placed charges throughout the warehouse. When they finished, they all left together. The police officers drove the Germans away in an official police vehicle. 45 minutes later, Black Tom Island ceased to exist. "I tried to tell people what I saw," Weiser's letter continued. "The fire chief, the police captain, even a reporter from the Jersey Journal. But every time I opened my mouth, someone would pull me aside and suggest I must be mistaken, must have been confused by the darkness, the smoke, the chaos. After a few days, I stopped trying. After a few weeks, I realised I probably shouldn't have tried at all." The letter was dated July 31st, 1916. According to records I found later, Samuel Weiser disappeared on August 3rd, 1916. His body was never found. The insurance ledger was the second thing I found in that trunk, and honestly, it might have been more damning than Weiser's letter. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers told a story of their own. The ledger belonged to Northeastern Mutual Insurance, a company that specialised in maritime and industrial coverage. Page after page of entries, all dated between August 1916 and December 1917, all related to Black Tom Island claims. The payouts were staggering, not just for the physical damage, that was expected, but for what the insurance industry calls business interruption claims. Companies that had been shipping ammunition through Black Tom collected millions of dollars for lost revenue, cancelled contracts, damaged relationships with European buyers. But here's what caught my attention. The companies collecting the biggest payouts weren't small operations that got wiped out by the explosion. They were massive corporations that simply redirected their business through other ports. DuPont collected $2.1 million. Bethlehem Steel got $1.8 million. Remington Arms walked away with nearly $3 million. For context, $3 million in 1916 money is about $80 million today. These companies didn't just recover from Black Tom, they profited from it. I started cross-referencing the names in the ledger with newspaper archives from 1917 and 1918. The pattern was unmistakable. Every single company that collected major Black Tom insurance payouts had executives who publicly advocated for American entry into World War I. They weren't just war profiteers, they were war lobbyists. DuPont's president, Irénée Dupont, gave speeches about America's moral obligation to join the fight against German aggression. Bethlehem Steel's Charles Schwab met privately with President Wilson 6 times between the Black Tom explosion and America's declaration of war. Remington's board included 2 former congressmen who had voted against neutrality measures. The explosion that was supposedly an attack on American interests had made the people pushing for war incredibly wealthy, and they had been incredibly well insured against exactly the kind of attack that happened. I found myself staring at those numbers for hours, adding and re-adding the totals. Northeastern Mutual had paid out over $15 million in Black Tom claims, about $400 million in today's money, for a single incident. For a company that size, that should have meant bankruptcy. But Northeastern Mutual didn't go bankrupt. According to financial records I found online, 1917 was their most profitable year ever. Someone had backed those payouts, someone with deep pockets and deeper connections, Someone who wanted those specific companies to have the capital they needed to ramp up war production. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that Samuel Weiser had been right. The blast was too perfect, too convenient. But it wasn't just German sabotage with American assistance. It was American sabotage with German patsies. Finding information about Samuel Weiser turned out to be like trying to catch smoke. The man had been systematically erased from public records. I started with the obvious places: birth certificates, marriage licenses, employment records. Jersey City Hall had a Samuel Weiser listed as employed by Black Tom Terminal from 1914 to 1916, but the file was incomplete. No address, no next of kin, no termination date. Just a note that said, employment ended August 1916. The Jersey Journal archives were more helpful, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I found 3 mentions of Samuel Weiser in the weeks following the Black Tom explosion. The first was in a list of witnesses being interviewed by federal investigators. The second was a brief quote in an article about the damage assessment, where he mentioned seeing unusual activity before the blast. The third mention was his obituary. Samuel Weiser, 34, dock worker, found deceased in Hudson River August 3, 1916. Cause of death listed as drowning. No known relatives. Services private. 12 words. Most people who die accidentally get more space than that, especially if they die in unusual circumstances, just days after being a witness to the biggest domestic attack in American history. But here's the thing that really bothered me. The obituary was dated August 4th, 1916, but it was printed on page 8 of the newspaper, buried between advertisements for patent medicines and notices about church socials. The Black Tom explosion was still front-page news, investigations were ongoing, and a key witness had just died mysteriously. You'd think that would warrant more than 12 words on page 8. I tried to find records of the investigation into Weiser's death. Police reports, coroner's findings, anything. Nothing. According to the Jersey City Police Department archives, there was no investigation. Samuel Weiser's death was ruled accidental drowning. Case closed, no follow-up required. A man who claimed to have witnessed American officials assisting German saboteurs was found dead in the Hudson River 4 days later, and nobody thought that was worth investigating. I found myself thinking about those police officers Weiser described, the ones with keys to the warehouses, the ones who escorted the Germans and then drove them away. If Weiser was telling the truth, those officers would have known he was watching from the office window. They would have seen the light, seen his silhouette against the glass. They would have known exactly who could identify them. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that Samuel Weiser hadn't drowned accidentally. He'd been silenced. And whoever silenced him had enough influence to make sure the investigation never happened. But Weiser had been smart enough to write that letter before they got to him. He'd documented what he saw, hidden it away, and hoped someone would eventually find it and ask the right questions. Someone like me. The problem was, if they had killed him for talking in 1916, what would they do to me for digging in 2023? The newspaper archives told a story of narrative manipulation that would make modern spin doctors proud. In the hours immediately following the Black Tom explosion, reporters had no idea what to write. The blast was unprecedented, the damage was massive, and nobody had any official explanation. So they wrote what they saw and what witnesses told them. The first newspaper accounts, published in evening editions on July 30th, described the explosion as an industrial accident of unprecedented scale. Reporters interviewed dock workers, nearby residents, anyone who had seen or heard something. The quotes were revealing. It looked like the whole harbour was on fire, read Manhattan resident. We heard 3 distinct explosions, not just one, Jersey City police officer. There were people running from the island before the first blast, like they knew it was coming. Brooklyn dock worker who was looking across the water with binoculars, but within 48 hours the narrative began to change. A new explanation emerged, seemingly from nowhere. German saboteurs. Articles started focusing on German spies, German plots, the German threat to American neutrality. Witness accounts that didn't fit this narrative simply disappeared from follow-up stories. I found draft articles in the archives of the New York Tribune that were never published. One reporter had interviewed a Black Tom security guard who claimed to have seen men in police uniforms acting suspicious on the night of the explosion. The article was pulled before publication, replaced with a piece about German espionage networks. Another unpublished draft described mysterious ships seen in the harbour before the explosion, ships that left immediately after the blast without offering assistance to rescue efforts. That story was replaced with speculation about German U-boats. The pattern was clear. Any information that suggested the explosion might have involved American officials or pointed to a more complex conspiracy was systematically removed from public discourse. Within a week, the story had solidified into something clean and simple. Germans bad, Americans victims, war justified. But the most disturbing thing I found wasn't what was published. It was what was buried in the government archives. I spent weeks requesting documents under the Freedom of Information Act. Most were denied or heavily redacted, but I managed to get partial access to files from the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI. What I found there made my blood run cold. Internal memos from August 1916 revealed that federal investigators knew within days that the official story didn't add up. Witness statements contradicted each other. Physical evidence suggested multiple coordinated explosions, not a single sabotage incident. And several witnesses had mentioned seeing American officials in the area before the blast. One memo, dated August 15, 1916, was particularly damning. Recommend suppression of witness statements that implicate domestic parties. German attribution serves national security interests. Case should be closed expeditiously to avoid public panic. The memo was signed by someone whose name was redacted, but the title was visible. Special Assistant to the President. President Woodrow Wilson's administration wasn't just covering up American involvement in Black Tom, they were actively suppressing evidence of it, and they were doing it to manipulate public opinion towards supporting the war. By 1917, when America officially entered World War I, the Black Tom explosion had become a rallying cry. German saboteurs had attacked American soil, damaged an American icon, killed American workers. It was Pearl Harbor before Pearl Harbor, 9/11 before 9/11. Except it wasn't. It was something much worse. An attack carried out with American assistance, covered up by American officials, and used to drag America into a war that made specific American companies incredibly wealthy. The cover-up wasn't just about hiding the truth, it was about weaponizing a lie. Standing on Liberty Island, looking up at the Statue of Liberty's torch, you can see the scars if you know where to look. The official tour guides will tell you that the torch has been closed to public access since 1916 due to structural damage from the Black Tom explosion. They make it sound like a minor inconvenience, a bit of historical trivia. The truth is much more disturbing. I managed to get access to the original engineering reports from 1916, filed by the Army Corps of Engineers immediately after the explosion. What they found was structural damage far beyond what has ever been publicly acknowledged. Shrapnel hadn't just embedded in the copper skin of the torch, it had penetrated deep into the internal framework, compromising the statue's structural integrity. But here's what really caught my attention. The pattern of damage wasn't consistent with a random explosion. The shrapnel strikes were concentrated on specific sections of the torch, almost like someone had aimed the blast to hit particular symbolic targets. The report included detailed photographs that I'd never seen before. Close-ups of the damage showed pieces of metal embedded in the statue's torch arm, but also in her crown and tablet. The inscription on the tablet, July 4, Mdkalekski, July 4, 1776, had been partially obliterated by shrapnel. Someone had damaged America's symbol of freedom on the anniversary month of American independence. If that was coincidence, it was a hell of a coincidence. I started researching the conspiracy theories that had grown up around the symbolic nature of the attack. Some claimed the timing and target selection were evidence of ritual occultism, that the explosion had been designed as a symbolic assault on American liberty itself. Others suggested the damage to the torch, a symbol of enlightenment, was meant to represent the extinguishing of American neutrality. Most of these theories were clearly nonsense, but they all shared a common thread: the recognition that the Black Tom explosion had been too precise, too symbolically loaded to be random sabotage. The engineering reports supported this interpretation. According to the technical analysis, The explosions had been carefully calculated to maximize symbolic damage while minimizing structural collapse. If the goal had been simply to destroy the ammunition depot, the charges could have been placed more efficiently. If the goal had been to cause maximum casualties, the timing would have been different. But if the goal had been to create a symbolic wound in America's most iconic monument, something that would remain visible for over a century as a reminder of foreign attack, then the placement and timing were perfect. The Statue of Liberty's torch remains closed to the public today, 107 years later. Every day, thousands of tourists look up at that damaged torch and remember that America has been attacked before. They remember that foreign enemies have struck at our symbols of freedom, but they don't know that the attack might have been an inside job. Standing there on Liberty Island, I found myself wondering about the people who planned this operation. They hadn't just wanted to destroy an ammunition depot or kill dock workers. They had wanted to wound America's soul, to create a permanent reminder of vulnerability and victimization. And they had wanted that wound to be visible from Manhattan forever. My grandfather had worked for Consolidated Maritime Insurance Company from 1965 to 1985. It was a small company that handled specialized marine and industrial policies, mostly for New Jersey businesses. When he retired, they gave him a modest pension and a company watch. When the company was bought out by a larger firm in 1995, most of the old records were supposed to be destroyed. But my grandfather had kept copies of some files. Insurance guys are paranoid about documentation. It's an occupational hazard. And apparently, Consolidated Maritime had inherited some very old files when they bought out Northeastern Mutual Insurance back in 1952. The same Northeastern Mutual that had paid out millions in Black Tom claims. I found my grandfather's old company login credentials in a shoebox, written on a piece of paper along with his social security number and pension account information. The login was for a digital archive system that Consolidated Maritime had set up in the 1990s to digitize their older paper files. I figured the system would be long dead, but insurance companies never throw anything away. The login still worked. What I found in those digital files made everything else look like child's play. Northeastern Mutual hadn't just insured the companies that profited from Black Tom, they had coordinated the whole thing. Internal memos from 1916 laid out the operation in chilling detail. Project Torchlight, target Black Tom Terminal, date July 30th, 1916, objectives 1. Eliminate munitions stockpile preventing competitor access to European markets. 2. Generate insurance payouts to capitalize client war production. 3. Create public sentiment favouring military engagement. There it was, in black and white corporate speak. Black Tom hadn't been sabotage at all. It had been a business plan. The memos outlined how Northeastern Mutual had coordinated with Jersey City Police to provide access to German agents who believed they were conducting legitimate sabotage operations. The Germans thought they were striking a blow against Allied supply lines. They had no idea they were being used as cover for an American corporate conspiracy. German assets have been provided with accurate facility maps and timing schedules. Police cooperation secured through standard municipal influence channels. Anticipated civilian casualties, minimal. Anticipated insurance exposure, $15 to $20 million. Anticipated client profits from war production acceleration, $150 to $200 million over 18 months. They had calculated the death toll. They had weighed American lives against corporate profits and decided the profits were worth it. Other files showed the web of connections that made the operation possible. Northeastern Mutual's board included former government officials, active military officers, and executives from major munitions companies. They hadn't just insured these companies, they had been partners with them. The conspiracy went all the way to Washington. One memo referenced presidential awareness and tacit approval for economic acceleration measures. Wilson himself might not have ordered the Black Tom explosion, but he'd known it was coming and allowed it to happen. But the most disturbing file was dated August 3rd, 1916, the day Samuel Weiser died. It was a brief note from the company's security consultant. Witness situation resolved. River disposal successful. Recommend standard accidental death processing. No further action required. They had murdered Samuel Weiser and documented it in their corporate files like it was just another business expense. As I sat there reading these files, I realised I was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that made Watergate look like a parking ticket. American corporate and government officials had orchestrated a terrorist attack on American soil, used German agents as patsies, murdered witnesses, and used the whole thing as justification for entering a profitable war. And then I realised something else. I was accessing these files through an internet connection. Someone would have logs of my access, digital footprints, timestamps, and IP addresses. If they had killed Samuel Weser for seeing too much in 1916, what would they do to me for seeing everything in 2023? That's when my laptop froze. The message appeared in the centre of my screen, white text on a black background. "You've found enough. Stop digging." I tried to close the browser, restart the computer, pull the power cord, nothing worked. The message just sat there, pulsing slightly, like it was breathing. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Unknown caller. I let it go to voicemail, but it started ringing again immediately. Same caller ID, same insistent tone. On the third call, I answered. "Mr. Harrison." The voice was calm, professional, completely emotionless. "You've been accessing some very old files tonight." They knew my name. They knew what I'd been doing. They were watching me in real time. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice cracked. Not exactly convincing. The Northeastern Mutual Archives. Consolidated Maritime Insurance Digital Records. Files related to the Black Tom incident of 1916. You accessed them at 11:47 p.m. using credentials belonging to Robert Harrison, deceased. Your grandfather, I believe. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. "That was rude," the voice said when I answered. "Let me explain your situation. You have discovered information that certain parties would prefer to remain private. You have accessed this information through unauthorized means, which makes you criminally liable. You have also, unfortunately for you, triggered several security protocols that notify us when these particular files are viewed." "Who is us?" I asked. "That's not important. What's important is that you understand the gravity of your situation. The Black Tom incident was resolved over a century ago. All parties involved are long deceased. The companies, the government officials, the insurance carriers, all gone. There is no one left to prosecute, no one left to blame, no one left to hold accountable." "Except the people covering it up," I said. "No," the voice said patiently. "There is no cover-up. There is simply institutional continuity. The files you've accessed are maintained for historical completeness, not because anyone intends to act on the information they contain. They are quite literally ancient history. Ancient history that you kill people to protect. Samuel Weser died in 1916. Anyone who might have ordered his death would be over 150 years old today. Do you see the problem with your conspiracy theory?" But I was starting to understand something else. The companies might be gone, but the money isn't. The profits from World War I, the insurance payouts, the connections, all of that got passed down, didn't it? To new companies, new families, new power structures. There was a pause. "You're smarter than I hoped you'd be. So what happens now? You kill me too?" "Mr. Harrison, we live in a different world than Samuel Weser did. In 1916, a dock worker could simply disappear without anyone asking difficult questions. Today, a young man with a laptop and a social media presence cannot vanish without generating exactly the kind of attention we prefer to avoid. So I'm safe? You're useful. Your grandfather kept copies of files he shouldn't have kept. His login credentials provided access to archives that should have been deleted decades ago. You've helped us identify security vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. For that we're grateful." I could hear typing in the background. "However, your usefulness has limits. You will not publish anything about Black Tom Island. You will not share the files you've accessed. You will not discuss this conversation with anyone. You will delete any copies you've made of these documents and return any physical materials you've found to their proper storage. And if I don't, then you'll discover that the methods we used to silence witnesses in 1916 were primitive compared to what we can do today. We don't need to throw you in the Hudson River, Mr. Harrison. We can destroy your credit, your employment, your relationships, your online presence, your entire existence without laying a finger on you. We can make you disappear into poverty and isolation while leaving you perfectly visible and alive." The line went dead. My laptop screen flickered and returned to normal, showing the insurance website I'd been browsing as if nothing had happened. But when I tried to access the Northeastern Mutual files again, I got an error message. Archive not found. They had locked me out. But more than that, they had probably deleted everything. All that evidence, all that proof, gone with a few keystrokes. I sat there in my apartment staring at my laptop screen, trying to process what had just happened. A century-old conspiracy, a corporate terrorist attack, government complicity, murder, cover-ups, and it was all just going to disappear back into the shadows where it had been hiding for over 100 years. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that grandfather only kept digital copies of the files. I still had the trunk. I still had Samuel Vaser's letter. I still had the insurance ledger with all those numbers and names and connections. The question was, what was I going to do with them? It's been 3 weeks since that phone call. 3 weeks of looking over my shoulder, checking my credit report, watching for signs that they're following through on their threats. So far, nothing. Maybe they think they've scared me enough. Maybe they're waiting to see if I keep my mouth shut. Maybe they're planning something I won't see coming. I keep thinking about Samuel Vader, about what it must have been like for him in those final days. He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and he knew they were coming for him. But he wrote that letter anyway. He documented the truth and hid it away, hoping someone would eventually find it and ask the right questions. Someone like me. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. Samuel Vaser wasn't the only witness who disappeared. After that phone call, I couldn't stop digging. Call it obsession. Call it stupidity. But I needed to know how deep this thing went. I started researching other people who had been in the area that night, other potential witnesses who might have seen what Vaser saw. What I found was a pattern of deaths that stretched far beyond one dock worker. Margaret Flynn, a nurse at the Jersey City Hospital who treated blast victims, died in a gas leak accident in her apartment on August 15th, 1916. She had given interviews to reporters about treating patients with unusual burns that looked more like chemical exposure than explosion injuries. Thomas McKenna, a railroad engineer who claimed to have seen official vehicles leaving Black Tom Island just before the explosion, died when his locomotive mysteriously derailed on August 22nd. The accident report blamed track malformation, but the tracks had been inspected and cleared just hours earlier. Father Giuseppe Toretti, an Italian priest who ran a mission near the waterfront, had been offering shelter to dock workers who were too afraid to return home after the explosion. He wrote in his parish newsletter that several workers had come to him with stories of American officials collaborating with foreign agents. Father Toretti died in his sleep on September the 3rd, officially from a heart attack, though he was only 38 years old and had no history of heart problems. Between August and December 1916, 17 people with direct or indirect connections to the Black Tom explosion died in what the authorities classified as accidents, suicides, or natural causes. 17 people who had either seen something suspicious or had contact with people who claimed to have seen something suspicious. The statistical probability of that many connected deaths occurring by chance is essentially zero. But the most chilling discovery came when I researched the police officers who would have been on duty that night. The Jersey City Police Department roster from July 30th, 1916, listed 12 officers assigned to the Black Tom area. By January 1917, only 4 were still alive. 3 had died in accidents. 2 had committed suicide. 3 had simply disappeared. Their personnel files noted they had abandoned their posts, and warrants were issued for desertion, but they were never found. The 4 survivors all received promotions and commendations for their heroic service during the Black Tom crisis. They went on to have distinguished careers, rising to positions of authority within the department. One became police chief in 1925. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who might have contradicted the official story was eliminated. Anyone who supported it was rewarded. The Black Tom explosion wasn't just sabotage. It was a blueprint for how corporate interests, government corruption, and foreign threats could be combined to manipulate American public opinion and justify profitable wars. It was a beta test for the military-industrial complex that would define American foreign policy for the next century. But more than that, it was a demonstration of how completely a democratic society could be controlled if you had enough money, enough influence, and enough willingness to kill your own citizens. insurance fraud, corporate greed, and hidden hands pushing America into war. These weren't aberrations. They were features. They were how the system was designed to work. And if they silenced 17 witnesses in 1916 to protect that system, what do you think they'll do to me? I've uploaded copies of everything to multiple cloud servers under fake accounts. I've mailed physical copies to journalists, historians, and conspiracy researchers around the country. I've created dead man switches that will automatically publish everything if I don't check in regularly. But I know it probably won't matter. They've had over a century to perfect their methods. They've had over a century to build networks of influence and control that make the 1916 conspiracy look like amateur hour. If they want this story buried, they'll find a way to bury it. And they've already started trying. 2 days after that phone call, I got a letter from the IRS audit notice. Random selection, they claimed. But the timing was suspiciously convenient. Then my credit card company called about unusual activity and froze my accounts pending a fraud investigation. My employer received an anonymous tip that I had been accessing company computers for personal research projects, which led to a formal disciplinary review. Each incident by itself could be coincidence. Together they formed a pattern of pressure designed to make me too busy dealing with bureaucratic nightmares to continue investigating Black Tom. But the real message came when I tried to access my grandfather's house. I drove to Jersey City last weekend, planning to go through the attic more thoroughly. Maybe there were other documents I had missed, other evidence that could corroborate Samuel Weiser's story. But when I got to the house, there was a condemned notice on the front door. According to the city building inspector who posted the notice, the house had structural integrity issues that made it unsafe for occupancy. The foundation was allegedly compromised, the roof was supposedly on the verge of collapse, and the electrical system posed an imminent fire hazard. Funny thing is, I'd been in that house just 3 weeks earlier, and it was perfectly fine, sturdy as the day it was built. But now, according to official city records, it was a death trap that needed to be demolished immediately. The demolition was scheduled for the following Monday, 72 hours from the time I received the notice. I called the building inspector's office trying to get more information about the inspection process, the specific problems they had identified, anything that might explain the sudden urgency. But the inspector who had signed the notice was unavailable, and his supervisor was in meetings all day. What I did learn, through some creative phone calls to neighbours, was that men in suits had been going door to door in the neighbourhood, asking about the old Harrison place, and whether anyone had seen suspicious activity around the property recently. They claimed to be federal investigators looking into potential environmental hazards, but they wouldn't show identification, and they left no business cards. The neighbours were scared. One elderly woman told me that the men had made it clear that asking too many questions about their investigations would not be in her best interests. I realised then that they weren't just trying to silence me. They were trying to eliminate all physical evidence of what I had discovered. The trunk, the documents, anything that might corroborate my story was about to be buried under a pile of rubble. So I did something stupid. I broke into my own grandfather's house. The structural integrity issues were bullshit, of course. The house was solid as a rock. But what I found in the attic made my blood run cold. The trunk was gone. Not just moved or damaged, completely gone, along with everything it had contained. Samuel Weiser's letter, the insurance ledger, the burned papers, all of it. In place of the trunk, there was a neat pile of ash on the attic floor, as if someone had burned everything and carefully swept up the remains. But they had missed something. Hidden behind a loose floorboard, I found another document, one I hadn't discovered during my first visit. It was a carbon copy of Samuel Weiser's letter, written in the same handwriting but addressed to someone different. Father Toretti, it began. If something happens to me, please make sure this information reaches the right people. This was Weiser's insurance policy. He had made copies of his account and hidden them with different people, hoping that even if they found and destroyed one version, another might survive. The letter to Father Toretti was identical to the one I had found in the trunk, but it included an additional paragraph at the end. They know I saw them. 2 of the police officers came by my boarding house yesterday, asking questions about my work schedule, my family, whether I'd been talking to reporters. They were friendly enough, but there was something in their eyes that made my skin crawl. I've decided to leave Jersey City for a while, maybe visit my cousin in Philadelphia until this all blows over. If you're reading this, it means I never made it to the train station." Samuel Weiser had known they were coming for him. He had tried to run, and they had caught him anyway. But more importantly, he had trusted Father Toretti with a copy of his story. The same Father Toretti who had died of a heart attack just a few weeks later. Still, I had to try. Samuel Weiser died trying to tell this story. Father Toretti died trying to protect it. The least I can do is risk my comfortable middle-class existence to tell it properly. Because the thing is, Black Tom wasn't a one-time event. It was a proof of concept. If you know what to look for, you can see the same patterns repeating throughout American history. Convenient attacks that justify profitable wars, corporate interest aligned with government policy, witnesses who disappear or discredit themselves. The methods get more sophisticated, but the fundamental approach remains the same. Create a crisis, control the narrative, profit from the solution. How many other foreign attacks on American soil have actually been domestic operations? How many other Samuel Weisers have been silenced before they could tell their stories? How many other trunks full of evidence are sitting in American attics, waiting for curious grandchildren to find them? I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I don't know if anyone will care enough to dig deeper. I don't know if I'll be around to find out. But I know this. The people who orchestrated the Black Tom explosion, who murdered Samuel Weiser, who have spent over a century protecting this secret, they're still out there. Maybe not the same individuals, but the same institutions, the same networks, the same fundamental corruption. And they're still... The recording cuts off abruptly. The file is time-stamped 3:17 a.m., November 15th, 2023. No further recordings have been found. What if I told you that buried beneath the frozen wastelands of Alaska lies something that could change everything we know about human history? Something that's not ancient at all, but very much alive. Tonight's story comes from a request by Matul Patel 9283. Thank you for this incredible suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these tales that blur the line between fact and fiction, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more mysterious stories that will keep you wondering. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I found beneath 200 feet of Alaskan permafrost, and why the government wants me to forget it ever existed. I'm a civil engineer, nothing glamorous about it. I measure soil density, calculate load-bearing capacities, and make sure buildings don't sink into the ground. For 15 years, I've worked contracts across the country, from Florida swamplands to Nevada deserts. Alaska was supposed to be just another job. The US Army Corps of Engineers hired me in March 2023 to survey land stability for a proposed pipeline route. Nothing unusual there. Energy companies are always looking to move oil from point A to point B, and they need someone to tell them their pipes won't crack when the ground shifts. The pay was good, the timeline was reasonable, and I needed the work. The assignment took me to a stretch of wilderness about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks. On paper, it looked simple, a 3-month survey of geological stability across a 40-mile corridor. I'd use ground-penetrating radar, seismographs and core samples to map what lay beneath the surface. Standard procedure. I should have known something was off when they gave me a satellite phone with specific instructions to check in every 12 hours. Weather can change fast up there, the project coordinator explained. We need to know you're alive. But Alaska's a dangerous place. People disappear into the wilderness all the time. It seemed reasonable. I flew into Fairbanks on a Tuesday in April, rented a heavy-duty pickup truck and loaded it with equipment. The drive to my assigned sector took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last 20 miles were barely more than frozen tyre tracks cutting through endless stands of black spruce and birch. When I finally reached my starting coordinates, the silence was absolute. No wind, no animals, no aircraft overhead. Just me, my equipment, and thousands of square miles of nothing. That's when the work began, and that's when everything I thought I knew about the world started to unravel. The first week went exactly as planned. I established a base camp with a generator-powered trailer and methodically began surveying the proposed pipeline route. The ground-penetrating radar showed typical permafrost patterns, layers of ice and soil that had been frozen for millennia. My seismograph readings were clean, showing the kind of stable bedrock that pipeline engineers love to see. Core samples revealed nothing unusual. Standard Arctic soil composition with good load-bearing characteristics. I was making excellent progress. Then, on day 8, something changed. I was setting up the radar array for the morning survey when I noticed interference patterns on my display. Instead of the usual chaotic scattering that indicates rock and soil, I was seeing geometric shapes. At first I assumed it was equipment malfunction. Electronic devices can act strangely in extreme cold, and I'd been pushing my gear hard. I recalibrated the radar, replaced cables, and ran diagnostic tests. Everything checked out perfectly, but the shapes remained straight lines, perfect 90-degree angles, and beneath everything a massive triangular form with sides that extended beyond my radar's maximum penetration depth of 200 feet. I switched to the seismograph, thinking maybe sound waves would give me different data. I set off small explosive charges and measured how the shock waves travelled through the ground. Standard geological surveying technique. The results made no sense. Sound waves were reflecting off something solid and geometrically perfect about 150 feet down. The reflection pattern showed clean edges, flat surfaces, and precise angles. In nature, you don't find precise angles. Rivers meander, mountains erode into curves, and rock formations crack in random patterns. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that day running every test I could think of. Different frequencies, multiple angles, overlapping surveys. Every single measurement confirmed the same impossible truth. There was a massive pyramid buried beneath the permafrost, and it was huge. My calculations suggested sides at least 800 feet long, significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The depth readings indicated it was sitting on bedrock, which meant it had been built on the surface and then buried by millions of years of geological processes. Except that made no sense either. Alaska's geological history doesn't include ancient civilizations capable of megalithic construction. The entire region was under glacial ice, until relatively recently in geological terms. I sat in my trailer that night staring at the printouts and digital displays, trying to find any explanation that didn't challenge everything I understood about engineering and archaeology. Maybe it was a natural formation that just happened to look geometric. Maybe my instruments were picking up interference from buried metal or deposits. Maybe the extreme cold was affecting my equipment in ways I didn't understand. But deep down I knew I was looking at something artificial, something that had been deliberately constructed and then hidden beneath the ice. The question was, who built it, and why? I needed supplies, and more importantly, I needed to talk to someone who knew the area's history. The nearest settlement was a village called Yukon Crossing. Population 127 according to the road sign. It was a 40-minute drive south on a road that tested every shock absorber in my truck. Yukon Crossing looked like a lot of rural Alaskan towns. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a general store and a combination post office / gas station. Most of the residents lived in trailer homes or log cabins scattered among the trees. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey columns against the bright spring sky. The general store served as the unofficial community centre. Inside, I found an elderly native Alaskan man named Joseph Kaltag behind the counter, selling everything from canned goods to ammunition to fishing gear. He looked like he'd been running the place for decades. "You're the pipeline engineer," he said before I could introduce myself. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Not much happens around here." He rang up my purchases: batteries, fuel canisters, and enough food to last another week. "You working up in the Forbidden Valley?" I looked up from counting cash. Forbidden Valley? Joseph's weathered face remained expressionless, but I caught something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or warning. "That's what my grandfather called it. Said the spirits there were angry. Animals won't go near it, and hunters who get too close." He shrugged. "Their compasses don't work right." "Magnetic interference," I said automatically. "Probably iron ore deposits in the bedrock. Maybe," he handed me my change, "or maybe some things are better left buried." I was loading supplies into my truck when a younger native woman approached. She introduced herself as Marie Kaltag, Joseph's granddaughter, and a pilot who flew supply runs to remote camps throughout the region. "I heard you talking to Grandpa," she said, "about the valley where you're working." He mentioned compass problems. Marie glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It's more than that. I've flown over that area maybe 50 times in the last 10 years. My instruments go crazy. GPS cuts out, radio gets static, engine RPMs fluctuate." "Electromagnetic interference," I suggested. That's what I thought too. But 3 years ago I was flying a supply run to a hunting camp about 20 miles north of your work site. Clear day, perfect visibility. I was following the river when my GPS started spinning. Compass needle was rotating like a clock hand. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. I looked down to try to navigate by landmarks, and I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Lines in the snow, geometric patterns like someone had carved designs into the landscape. They were huge, maybe a mile across and perfectly symmetrical. Could have been natural formations, wind patterns, erosion channels. Marie shook her head. "I've been flying over Alaska my whole life. I know what natural looks like. This was artificial. And when I flew back over the same area a week later, the lines were gone, covered by fresh snow." I thanked her for the information and headed back to camp, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Geometric patterns in the snow, electromagnetic interference, compasses spinning wildly. It all pointed to the same conclusion I was trying to avoid. Something beneath the permafrost was actively affecting the environment around it. That night, I reviewed my survey data again, looking for any detail I might have missed. The pyramid structure was consistent across all my measurements, but there was something else. Subtle variations in the electromagnetic readings that suggested complex internal architecture. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a solid mass of stone. It had chambers, passages, and what looked like intricate internal mechanisms. And according to my instruments, some of those mechanisms were drawing electrical current. I woke up on day 12 to the sound of helicopter rotors. From my trailer window I could see a Black Hawk settling onto a flat area about 200 yards from my camp. No military markings, but the aircraft had the unmistakable look of government hardware. 3 men in winter camouflage climbed out as the rotors spun down. They walked directly to my trailer with the confident stride of people who expected cooperation. The leader was a tall man with close-cropped hair and reflective sunglasses. His companions looked like soldiers trying to dress like civilians, too alert, too fit, and carrying themselves like they had weapons hidden under their jackets. "Mr. Harrison," the leader said, reading my name from a tablet. "I'm Agent Collins, Department of Homeland Security. We need to discuss your recent survey findings." I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral. I wasn't aware DHS had jurisdiction over pipeline surveys. "We have jurisdiction over potential national security threats." Collins gestured toward my equipment array. "Your seismic activity has been flagged by our monitoring systems. We need to examine your data and confiscate any materials related to subsurface anomalies." "What subsurface anomalies?" Collins removed his sunglasses, revealing pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Mr. Harrison, we know exactly what you found down there. The question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or make this difficult. I had 2 choices: hand over my data willingly or watch them take it by force. Either way, they were getting what they wanted. "The hard drives are in the trailer," I said. One of Collins' men immediately headed inside while the other began disconnecting my external monitoring equipment. They worked with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this type of confiscation. "How long have you known it was there?" I asked. Collins was quiet for a long moment, apparently deciding how much to tell me. "The structure first appeared on our deep scanning systems in 1992. We've been monitoring it ever since." "Appeared? You mean you discovered it in 1992? "No, Mr. Harrison. I mean it appeared in 1992. Prior to that date, our scans showed normal bedrock composition. Then something changed." The man emerging from my trailer handed Collins a bag containing my hard drives and backup storage devices. They had also taken my printed survey maps and handwritten notes. 1992, I said, thinking out loud. That's when China conducted their largest underground nuclear test. Collins' expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, that I'd made that connection. "The Lopner test was 3,800 miles away," he said. "There's no possible connection." But his tone suggested otherwise, and I remembered something from my geological studies. Seismic waves from large underground explosions can travel through the Earth's crust and trigger responses in sensitive areas thousands of miles away. What if the Chinese nuclear test had somehow activated whatever was buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost? "You're being reassigned," Collins continued, handing me an official-looking document. "Your contract has been terminated due to unforeseeable circumstances. A helicopter will arrive tomorrow morning to transport you back to Fairbanks." "What about my equipment?" "It's been contaminated by proximity to hazardous materials. Standard decontamination procedures require disposal." That was obviously a lie. There were no hazardous materials in the area. I'd have detected them during my survey. They were confiscating everything because they didn't want me to have any physical evidence of what I'd found. "One more thing," Collins said as his team prepared to leave. "You'll be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before returning to civilian areas. The penalty for violating that agreement is 10 years in federal prison." They climbed back into their helicopter and lifted off, leaving me alone with my suddenly empty trailer and a growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a pipeline survey. But I still had one advantage. They thought they'd taken all my data. They were wrong. I've always been paranoid about data backup. Too many years of watching hard drives crash and taking blame for lost survey information. So I keep a small handheld GPS unit with built-in memory storage that automatically logs all my location coordinates and instrument readings. Collins and his team had missed it because it was clipped to my belt, looked like standard hiking gear, and wasn't connected to my main computer systems. That night, I reviewed the stored data on the device's tiny screen. Everything was there. Coordinates, depth readings, electromagnetic measurements, and seismic mapping data. Enough information to prove that something massive and artificial was buried beneath the permafrost. But proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand what it was and why the government was so determined to keep it secret. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed. I was going back to the site for one final investigation. The helicopter pickup was scheduled for 8 a.m, which gave me about 6 hours of darkness to work with. I loaded basic equipment into my backpack: a handheld GPS, a digital camera, a small electromagnetic field detector, and a battery-powered radio, and hiked back to the survey area. The night was clear and bitterly cold. My breath formed ice crystals that seemed to hang in the air, and the snow crunched under my boots with sounds like breaking glass. Above me, the aurora borealis painted green curtains across the star-filled sky. I reached the coordinates where my instruments had detected the pyramid's apex. According to my calculations, I was standing directly above the structure's highest point, about 120 feet below my boots. The handheld detector immediately started showing readings. Electromagnetic activity was significantly higher than background levels, and it seemed to be increasing. The device's small screen showed wave patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat, regular pulses of energy rising and falling in consistent cycles. I took photos of the instrument readings and recorded GPS coordinates, building a digital record that I could hopefully smuggle out of Alaska. But as I worked, something strange began happening. The aurora overhead was changing. Instead of the usual flowing curtains of light, it was forming geometric patterns, straight lines and angular shapes that mirrored the underground structure. It was as if the buried pyramid was somehow influencing the electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere. That's when I felt the vibration. It started as a barely perceptible tremor in the ground, like the feeling of a distant freight train. But it quickly intensified until I could feel it in my bones, a deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with the electromagnetic readings on my detector. The device's screen was flashing warnings. Energy levels were spiking far beyond anything I'd measured during my official survey. Whatever was buried down there was waking up. I started backing away from the site, but before I could get more than 50 yards, everything electronic I carried died simultaneously. The GPS unit, the detector, my digital camera, even my LED flashlight, all dead, as if something had delivered a massive electromagnetic pulse. Above me, the aurora was blazing brighter than I had ever seen, forming complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to be humming with energy, and I could feel static electricity building up on my clothing and exposed skin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The aurora faded back to normal patterns. The ground vibration ceased. The electrical sensation disappeared. I was left standing in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in complete darkness, holding a handful of dead electronics. I stumbled back toward camp using starlight for navigation, reaching my trailer just before dawn. When I tried to start my truck, the engine turned over immediately. Apparently whatever had killed my handheld electronics hadn't affected the vehicle's more robust electrical system. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't natural. The buried pyramid wasn't just an ancient artifact or geological formation. It was some kind of active installation that could influence electromagnetic fields across a wide area. The question was, what was its purpose? The helicopter arrived exactly at 8 a.m, piloted by a civilian contractor who seemed unaware that he was participating in a government cover-up. During the flight back to Fairbanks, I signed the non-disclosure agreement Collins had mentioned, legally binding myself to remain silent about my discoveries. But signing the paper didn't erase my memory, and it didn't eliminate the data I'd managed to keep hidden. I flew back to Seattle that afternoon and spent the next 2 weeks trying to return to normal life. I updated my resume, contacted potential clients, and attempted to focus on finding my next engineering contract. But I couldn't stop thinking about what lay buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat down with my laptop and started researching everything I could find about electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, and the 1992 Chinese nuclear test that Agent Collins had mentioned. What I discovered changed everything. The Chinese test, conducted at the Lop Nua facility on May 21, 1992, was indeed one of the largest underground nuclear explosions ever detonated. The blast was so powerful that seismic monitoring stations around the world recorded the shockwaves as they travelled through the Earth's crust. But that wasn't the interesting part. I found archived scientific papers describing unusual electromagnetic phenomena that occurred globally in the days following the test. Radio disruptions, satellite communication failures, and compass anomalies were reported from locations thousands of miles away from the blast site. Most significantly, several research stations in Alaska reported sudden spikes in local electromagnetic activity, beginning approximately 6 hours after the Chinese detonation. Exactly the amount of time it would take seismic waves to travel through the Earth's crust from Lopner to Alaska. I cross-referenced these reports with geological surveys of the Alaskan region and found something that made my blood run cold. Every single electromagnetic anomaly had been reported from locations within a 50-mile radius of my survey site. Whatever was buried there had indeed been activated by the Chinese nuclear test, just as Collins had implied, but the implications went far beyond a simple cause and effect relationship. I started plotting the locations of other reported anomalies on a world map, looking for patterns. What I found was a global network of similar sites, places where electromagnetic activity had spiked following major seismic events, underground installations that seemed to respond to specific triggers. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that the Alaskan pyramid wasn't unique. It was part of a worldwide system of buried structures, all apparently designed to respond to geological disturbances, but designed by whom, and for what purpose? I thought back to the night I'd witnessed the energy pulse, remembering how the aurora borealis had formed geometric patterns directly above the burial site. Aurora phenomena are caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's magnetic field. If the underground structure could influence those interactions, it was essentially broadcasting energy into space. What if the buried pyramids weren't ancient monuments at all? What if they were communication devices, a global network designed to transmit signals to somewhere far beyond Earth? The possibility was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. If I was right, then humanity shared the planet with technology that predated our entire civilization by potentially millions of years. Technology that was still active, still responding to triggers, still sending messages to unknown recipients. I spent weeks researching similar sites around the world, building a database of locations where unusual electromagnetic phenomena had been reported following major seismic events. The pattern that emerged was undeniable, a global network of transmission stations, all apparently activated by disturbances in the Earth's crust. But before I could take my research any further, I received a letter that ended my investigation permanently. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after my return from Alaska. It was delivered by certified mail to my apartment address, though I hadn't given that information to anyone connected with the pipeline project. The return address showed only Department of Interior Special Projects Division, with a Washington, D.C. postal box number. Inside was a single page of official letterhead containing a brief message. Mr. Harrison, this communication serves as final notice regarding your terminated contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, project classification, Black Ice. Subsequent to your departure from the survey area, additional geological analysis has determined that the subsurface structure you detected is not archaeological in nature. The structure is an active installation of unknown origin that poses potential risks to national security. Any attempt to publicise information related to this discovery will result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. Your signed non-disclosure agreement remains in full effect indefinitely. The installation you discovered is not a relic. It is a machine. Do not pursue further inquiry. Sincerely, Director, Special Projects Division. I read the letter 3 times before the full implication sank in. They weren't denying what I'd found. They were confirming it. The underground structure was artificial. It was active. And the government had known about it for over 30 years without understanding what it was or who had built it. But the most chilling aspect was the letter's final warning. It is a machine, not a monument, not an archaeological site, not a natural formation, a machine. I thought about the energy pulse I'd witnessed, the geometric patterns in the aurora, the electromagnetic signals that seemed to respond to seismic events around the world. If the buried pyramid was indeed a machine, then its purpose was clear. It was designed to detect and respond to geological disturbances by transmitting signals into space. The question remained, signals to whom? I lock the letter in a safety deposit box along with copies of all my survey data and research findings. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence that the discovery had been made. But I never published my findings. I never contacted journalists or researchers or anyone else who might be interested in the truth about what lay beneath the Alaskan permafrost, because I realised that some knowledge carries a price too high to pay. If there really was a global network of alien communication devices buried beneath our feet, broadcasting our planet's geological status to unknown recipients in space, then humanity was living on borrowed time. We were tenants on a world that belonged to someone else, someone who had installed monitoring equipment long before our species existed. The machines weren't dormant relics of an ancient civilization. They were active components of a surveillance system that was still operational after millions of years. And every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every nuclear test was sending updates to whoever had built them. I returned to my normal life as a civil engineer, taking contracts that kept me far from Alaska and far from any situation that might uncover similar installations. I told myself that ignorance was safer than knowledge, that some secrets were better left buried. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening, and I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. For 6 months, I managed to convince myself that forgetting was possible. I took contracts in familiar territories, building inspections in suburban developments, soil analysis for shopping mall construction, routine work that involved nothing more mysterious than concrete and rebar. Then the dream started. At first they were just fragments, flashes of geometric light, the sound of deep humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones, the sensation of standing on solid ground while everything around me pulsed with invisible energy. I'd wake up with my heart racing and a metallic taste in my mouth as if I'd been breathing electrified air. But the dreams became more vivid as weeks passed. I began seeing the pyramid not from above, as I had during my survey, but from within. Vast chambers carved from black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Corridors that stretched beyond the reach of any illumination, filled with the constant sound of machinery that had been running for millennia. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved through the passages, tall, elongated forms that seemed more like geometric projections than living beings. They moved with purpose, tending to controls and displays that covered the walls in intricate patterns of light and symbol. The most disturbing part was that they seemed aware of me. In the dreams, they would pause their activities and turn toward me with attention that felt like cold judgment. Without faces I could recognize, without voices I could understand, they somehow communicated a single clear message. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. I consulted a sleep specialist, thinking the dreams were delayed stress responses from my time in Alaska. She prescribed medication that helped me fall asleep but didn't stop the visions. If anything, the drugs made them more intense, more real, more impossible to dismiss as products of an overwrought imagination. It was during one of these medicated dreams that I saw something new, a global map covered in points of light, each one marking a location where similar pyramids lay buried. The network stretched across every continent, even beneath the ocean floors, hundreds of installation sites, all connected by lines of energy that pulsed in synchronized patterns. I woke from that dream with absolute certainty that I was seeing something real. The buried machines weren't isolated installations. They were nodes in a planetary communication grid that spanned the entire world. 3 days later, I made a decision that changed everything. I started investigating again. Using the global locations from my dreams as starting points, I began researching electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained phenomena at similar sites around the world. What I found was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. Every location where I'd dreamed of seeing a pyramid corresponded to a place where unusual events had been reported. The Nazca lines in Peru, built over an area where aircraft instruments malfunctioned regularly. The underwater structures near Bimini in the Bahamas, where submarines had reported mechanical failures and compass deviations. The Giza Plateau in Egypt, where modern surveys had detected massive voids beneath the known pyramids. Each site shared common characteristics: electromagnetic interference, geometric precision in ancient or unexplained structures, and a history of covering up or dismissing scientific findings that couldn't be easily explained. But the most significant pattern was temporal. Every site had experienced increased activity following major seismic events, exactly like the Alaskan installation after the 1992 Chinese nuclear test. I compiled a database of seismic events and electromagnetic anomalies dating back 50 years. The correlation was undeniable. Large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and underground nuclear tests consistently triggered responses from specific locations around the globe. The buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity, they were responding to it, broadcasting information about Earth's internal dynamics to receivers beyond our planet. I was building a case for the existence of a global alien surveillance network when I made a discovery that terrified me more than anything I'd found so far. The activity was increasing. According to my research, electromagnetic anomalies at these sites had been relatively stable for decades, showing only minor fluctuations in response to major geological events. But starting in 2020, the baseline activity levels had begun rising at all locations simultaneously. Something was changing. The network was becoming more active, more responsive, more awake. I plotted the activity increases on a timeline and noticed they correlated with something unexpected. The global increase in seismic activity over the past few years. More earthquakes, more volcanic eruptions, more geological instability than had been recorded in previous decades. What if the relationship wasn't cause and effect? What if the buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity? What if they were causing it? The possibility was so disturbing I initially dismissed it as paranoid speculation. But the more I studied the data, the more compelling the evidence became. The timing was too precise, the correlations too consistent. If I was right, then humanity was living on a planet where alien technology was actively destabilizing the geological systems that supported all life on Earth. But why? What possible purpose could be served by triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? The answer came to me during another dream, but this time I was prepared. I had set up a digital recorder beside my bed, hoping to capture any words or sounds I might make while experiencing the visions. What I heard when I played back the recording the next morning was my own voice, but speaking words I didn't remember saying. Stress testing, planetary stability assessment, structural analysis phase approaching completion. I'd somehow been speaking in the technical language of engineering, describing the geological chaos as if it were a planned evaluation of the planet's physical integrity. The machines weren't trying to destroy Earth, they were testing it. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into geological data, looking for patterns that might support my terrifying hypothesis. What I found convinced me that the buried network was conducting a systematic analysis of Earth's structural stability. Seismic events weren't random, they were following a pattern. Stress points in tectonic plates were being tested in sequence, as if something was methodically evaluating how much pressure the planet's crust could withstand before catastrophic failure. The 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the increasing volcanic activity in Indonesia, Italy and Iceland, the unprecedented earthquake swarms in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas. All of these events clustered around locations where I'd identified buried installations. I created detailed models showing how the network might be triggering these events through focused electromagnetic pulses directed at specific geological fault lines. The technology required would be far beyond human capabilities, but for a civilization that could build planet-spanning monitoring networks, it would be routine engineering. But the most chilling aspect of my research was the timeline. If the current rate of geological testing continued, the network would have evaluated every major tectonic system on Earth within the next 5 to 10 years. What would happen when the testing phase was complete? I spent sleepless nights imagining scenarios, planetary mining operations that required clearing the surface of inconvenient biological life, terraforming projects that would remake Earth's atmosphere and geology, or simple property reclamation by the network's builders returning to a world they had left unattended for millennia. None of the possibilities included a future for human civilization. It was during this period of growing despair that I received an unexpected contact that changed everything once again. The email appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning with a subject line that made my blood freeze. Alaskan survey data, classification black ice. The sender's address was scrambled text that looked like a random string of characters, clearly routed through multiple encryption services to hide its origin. But the message content was brief and specific. Mr. Harrison, we know what you've discovered about the global network. Your research parallels investigations conducted by others who have encountered similar installations. A meeting has been arranged. Be at the Starbucks on Pine Street in downtown Seattle tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Bring your data. You're not the only one who has seen the machines. The message included no signature, but attached to it was a single photograph that made my hands shake. An image of my own survey equipment at the Alaskan site, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching my investigation from a significant distance. Someone had been monitoring me during my time in Alaska, someone who wasn't part of Agent Collins' government team. I spent the entire night debating whether to attend the meeting. It could be a trap, government agents trying to identify how much I knew and what evidence I still possessed. Or it could be exactly what it claimed, contact with others who had discovered the truth about the buried network. In the end, curiosity won over caution. I needed to know if I was really alone in this knowledge, or if there were others working to understand the threat humanity was facing. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual mix of students, business people and remote workers when I arrived at exactly 3 p.m. I ordered coffee and found a table near the back, trying to identify anyone who might be waiting for me. At 3:15, a woman in her 50s approached my table. She had greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore field clothing that suggested outdoor work, and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to physical challenges. "Mr. Harrison," she extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Webb. I think we need to talk." She sat down across from me and immediately began speaking in low, urgent tones. "I'm a marine archaeologist. 3 years ago, I was leading a deep-sea survey off the coast of Bermuda, when my team discovered an underwater structure that shouldn't exist. Geometric, massive, and actively generating electromagnetic fields that interfered with our equipment. She opened a tablet and showed me sonar images that looked remarkably similar to my ground-penetrating radar data from Alaska. A pyramid-shaped structure, perfectly symmetrical, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly a mile. When we tried to publish our findings, the research was classified and our funding was terminated. Sound familiar? I nodded, unable to speak. Catherine continued, but I kept investigating privately. I found evidence of at least 12 similar installations in deep ocean locations around the world. All of them show the same characteristics: geometric precision, electromagnetic activity, and apparent activation following seismic events. She showed me more images: underwater structures near Japan, the Mediterranean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Each one was clearly artificial, clearly ancient, and clearly active. There are others, she said. A geologist in Australia who found similar structures in the outback. An archaeologist in Egypt who discovered chambers beneath the Sphinx that contain technology that shouldn't exist. A seismologist in Chile who documented electromagnetic pulses preceding earthquake activity. How many others? We've identified 17 researchers worldwide who have encountered installations or phenomena that appear to be part of the same network. Most have been silenced through official pressure, funding cuts, or career destruction. A few have simply disappeared. Catherine leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But some of us have continued working in secret. We've been sharing data, building a comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with. And what are we dealing with? A global surveillance and control system that's been operating for thousands of years, possibly millions. The installations aren't just monitoring Earth, they're managing it, controlling geological processes, atmospheric composition, even biological evolution through environmental manipulation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We're not alone on this planet. We never have been. The question is whether humanity developed naturally, or whether we're the result of controlled biological development guided by whoever built the network. Catherine showed me more data, archaeological evidence of genetic bottlenecks in human evolution that corresponded to periods of unusual geological activity, atmospheric changes that seemed to follow patterns rather than random climate variation, even extinction events that appeared to have been artificially triggered. The network has been shaping Earth's development for millions of years, she said. Every mass extinction, every ice age, every major evolutionary leap has been guided by the installations. But why? What's the purpose? Catherine's expression was grim. We think Earth is being prepared for something. The stress testing you've documented, the increasing seismic activity, the atmospheric changes, it all points to final preparations for some kind of major transition. Transition to what? We don't know, but based on the escalating activity levels, we estimate it will begin within the next few years. She handed me a secure phone with an encrypted communication app. If you want to help us understand what we're facing, this will put you in contact with the others. We're working to decode transmissions from the installations to map the complete network, and to find some way to predict what's coming. What if we can't stop it? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then at least humanity will know the truth before the end. Over the following months, I became part of an underground network of researchers from around the world. Using encrypted communications and careful operational security, we shared data, theories, and discoveries about the installations that had consumed our professional lives. What emerged from our collective research was a picture of Earth that challenged everything humanity believed about our planet and our place in the universe. The installation network was vast. Over 300 confirmed sites across all continents and ocean floors. Each site contained structures of identical design but varying scale, all built from materials that didn't match any known geological formations. The construction showed evidence of technology far beyond human capabilities, with precision that exceeded our best modern engineering. But the most significant discovery came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a linguist and cryptographer in Japan who'd been analysing electromagnetic transmissions intercepted from the installations. The transmissions weren't random energy pulses. They were coded communications in a mathematical language that described Earth's physical and biological status in incredible detail. Real-time reports on atmospheric composition, geological stability, ocean chemistry, magnetic field fluctuations and biological diversity levels. More disturbing were the projections embedded in the transmissions, mathematical models showing how Earth systems would respond to various environmental stresses, including massive geological disruptions, atmospheric changes and population adjustments. The network was continuously updating these models based on data from the stress testing we documented. Each earthquake, each volcanic eruption, each environmental change provided new information that refined the projections, and all of the models pointed to the same conclusion: a massive intervention scheduled to begin when current biological systems reached predetermined stress thresholds. We were approaching those thresholds rapidly. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, and social instability were all being monitored by the network. But rather than random consequences of human activity, they appeared to be planned phases in a managed transition process. Humanity hadn't created the environmental crisis. We were living through the final stages of a controlled experiment that had been running for thousands of years. The realization was overwhelming. Every environmental disaster, every resource shortage, every social conflict was part of a planned sequence designed to bring Earth's biological systems to a specific end state. But what would replace them? The answer came from an unexpected source: my dreams. As I became more deeply involved with the research network, my nighttime visions became more detailed and informative. I was seeing not just the installations, but the purpose they served. The geometric beings I encountered in the dreams weren't aliens. They were artificial intelligences, created by the network's builders to manage Earth's transition through automated systems. The real builders were gone, had been gone for millions of years, but they had left behind a planetary management system, designed to prepare Earth for their eventual return. The stress testing, the environmental manipulation, the biological management. It was all preparation for recolonization by a species that had left Earth eons ago and was now ready to reclaim it. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. Because now I know the truth. We are temporary occupants of a world that has always belonged to someone else. The installations beneath our feet are counting down to a transition that will remake Earth according to specifications we cannot understand for purposes we cannot imagine. The truth is out there, buried beneath the ice in places like Alaska, waiting for the next contractor or surveyor or accidental discoverer to stumble across it. When that happens, and it will happen eventually, I hope they're wiser than I was. I hope they don't go back for one final look in the darkness, because some machines are better left undisturbed, and some signals are better left unsent. But the signals are being sent anyway, carrying reports of a planet ready for reclamation by its original inhabitants. The countdown has begun, and we are running out of time to understand what we're facing, or to find a way to survive what's coming.